At midnight, Inspector Cramer hides a letter, born of pressure, pride, or fear, and only Nero Wolfe with Archie can uncover its truth. Welcome to Sayers and Secrets. From where in the world are you joining us tonight? Share in the comments. Now, light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. If you've ever seen Nero Wolfe disturbed before 11 in the morning, congratulations. You've witnessed a natural phenomenon rarer than a solar eclipse. I was halfway through my coffee. Fritz had just set down Wolfe's second helping of corn muffins, and the big man was deep in his morning battle with the Times crossword when I noticed it. The envelope that usually lived in the top left drawer of his desk, the one he keeps under lock like it's the nation's crown jewels, was gone. I'm not in the habit of snooping, but when you spend as much time in that office as I do, you notice landmarks. That drawer had always contained an envelope sealed in Wolfe's thick wax stamp. Today, the drawer yawned empty. Something wrong, Archie? Wolfe didn't look up. He was penciling in a 6-letter word for fastidious eater. The irony wasn't lost on me. I don't like gaps in your furniture, I said. That drawer looks naked. Pfui. Wolfe's grunt meant I'd scored a hit, but he wasn't ready to admit it. It is of no consequence. No consequence, I echoed. You keep that drawer locked tighter than a banker's smile, and today it's empty. That's not a coincidence. It's a plot development. Wolfe sighed, folded the newspaper, and reached for the muffins. Archie, cease dramatizing. Breakfast is no stage for invention. Before I could retort, the doorbell rang. Fritz, balancing dignity and dish towels, glanced at Wolfe. Wolfe closed his eyes as though hoping the world might dissolve if he ignored it. Answer it, he muttered. I went, muttering back about how the man ran a detective agency, yet considered visitors a personal affront. When I opened the door, I almost checked the calendar to make sure it wasn't April Fool's. Inspector Kramer stood there, shoulders hunched against the morning chill, clutching a brown envelope like it contained nitroglycerin. His cigar wasn't even lit. That's how wrong things were. Goodwin. His voice was low, urgent. I need Wolfe. Sure, come on in. He's having muffins and pretending not to care about missing envelopes. You'll fit right in. Kramer brushed past me, which for him counts as polite. He stomped into the office, and Wolfe gave him the look reserved for tax bills and unripe peaches. Inspector. Wolfe's tone was ice-shaved fine. You presume upon my breakfast? Stuff it, Wolfe. This is serious. Kramer slapped the envelope onto the desk. Keep this. Do not open it until midnight. No one sees it. No one. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. You would turn my office into a post office? I'm dead serious, Kramer said, and I noticed his hand was trembling. If anyone asks, you don't have it, understand? Wolfe leaned back, studying him like a botanist inspecting a wilted flower. Your behavior is extraordinary. Explain. I can't. Kramer's jaw tightened. Not yet. That was all. He turned, stalked past me, and was gone. I followed to the door, watching him stride off like a man with a noose around his neck. When I got back to the office, Wolfe was frowning at the envelope. In the upper left corner, written in bold black ink, was a single character, C. I didn't say it out loud, but I was thinking it. Wolfe's missing envelope had just gotten company, and neither one of us was going to like what was inside. When Wolfe finally spoke, his eyes hadn't left the envelope, and his voice was so flat it might have been mistaken for calm if you didn't know him. Archie, put it in the safe. That was all, not a flicker of curiosity, not a protest that his breakfast had been sullied by intrusion. Just an order. I did as told, though I couldn't help noticing the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, the kind he gets when he's trying not to show he's interested. Wolfe uninterested is the 8th wonder of the world. Wolfe pretending not to be interested is the 9th. I tucked the envelope inside the safe, spun the dial, and turned back to him. There. Now what? He poured beer, lifted it, and said, Now nothing. We will await midnight. That was Wolfe for you. Shut the door on a volcano and assume it would hold. I opened my mouth to push, but the sound of heavy steps crossing the hall interrupted. Fritz, who never wears urgency unless it's stitched on his apron, appeared in the doorway. Archie, he said, his voice careful. Another visitor. Of course, I muttered. Why not turn this place into Grand Central while we're at it? I went to the door again. This time it was a man in a dark overcoat, collar turned up, hat pulled low. He had the look of someone who knew which side of a street to stick to if he wanted to stay unnoticed. He didn't offer a name, just shoved a folded card into my hand. On it, in block letters, was written, Keep Kramer's trust. Midnight decides. I looked up, ready to ask him what circus he'd escaped from, but the man was already halfway down the stoop, melting into the Saturday morning traffic. I shut the door and brought the card in, tossing it onto Wolfe's desk like a calling card from fate. Another friend of yours? I asked. Wolfe lifted it between two fingers, read it, and set it down with distaste. No. Short, sweet, and about as comforting as a rattlesnake in your shoe. Wolfe pressed the bell for beer again, though the first glass sat unfinished. That was his version of pacing. Archie, phone Saul Panzer. Instruct him to follow Inspector Cramer from here forward. He will know the terms. That was Wolfe speak for. Kramer's in deeper than he'll admit, and I want a lifeline tied to him. I rang Saul, gave him the facts in my usual breezy style, and hung up. Saul didn't waste breath with questions. He'd move like clockwork. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed, fingers steepled. I'd seen the pose before. It was the position. He assumed when the world annoyed him, but he wasn't ready to commit calories to fighting back. You think Kramer's playing courier? I asked. I think, Wolfe said, opening his eyes a slit. He is ensnared. If he wished secrecy, he would not have brought his burden here. He is under compulsion. That tremor in his hand, I said. Yeah, I noticed. The office quieted, except for the ticking of the big wall clock and Wolfe's breathing. Fritz retreated to his kitchen like a diplomat, removing himself from hostilities. I took a seat and thumbed through the morning mail, though I doubt I read a word of it. My ears were still tuned to the echo of Kramer's voice. Keep it. Don't open it until midnight. Around 11, the phone rang. I picked it up. A woman's voice, husky with tension, said, You have something that doesn't belong to you. Lady, if you're talking about a library book, we're innocent. Wolfe hasn't left the house since Prohibition. Don't play games. She drew in a shaky breath. Inspector Cramer left an envelope there. If you value his life, you'll burn it. I glanced at Wolfe, who had opened his eyes fully now, studying me like I was the one under interrogation. Sorry, I told her. We're fresh out of matches. The line went dead. I set the receiver down slowly. That was a lady with lung capacity and a message. Burn the envelope or Kramer gets it. Wolfe's nostrils flared. Idiocy. To destroy it would be to surrender to coercion. Sure, but what if they're not bluffing? They may not be. That is their leverage. He frowned, deep creases carving his forehead. Archie, note. One female voice, strained, attempting menace, but betraying alarm. Got it. But if she's telling the truth, Kramer's walking into a meat grinder. The bell rang again. I went to the door, half expecting the woman herself. Instead, a package sat neatly on the stoop. No delivery man in sight. Brown paper, twine, no return address. I carried it in, set it on Wolfe's desk, and waited. He regarded it with all the enthusiasm of a man offered a second helping of poison mushrooms. Open it. Why me? Because you are expendable. I grinned. That's the nicest thing you've said to me all week. I slit the twine and peeled the paper back. Inside was a photograph. Grainy, black and white, obviously taken in haste. It showed Kramer in a diner booth last night by the look of the clock on the wall. Across from him sat a man I didn't recognize. Gaunt face, sharp nose, eyes like drill bits. On the back, in the same block lettering as the card, "Midnight ends him, unless." Wolfe's lips tightened. He reached for the bell, not for beer this time, but for Fritz. "Fritz, the phone. I require Mr. Panzer." Fritz fetched the instrument, and Wolfe barked the order. "Saul, where is Kramer?" "Very well. Remain close. Report every half hour." He hung up and turned to me. "Archie, inform Mr. Stebbins that his superior may be in jeopardy. Do not mention the envelope." "You think Kramer's being framed?" "I think," Wolfe said slowly, "he is being maneuvered. The bait lies in that envelope. Until midnight, we are tethered to their game." I phoned Stebbins, fed him a watered-down version of concern for his boss's safety, and dodged his inevitable growl for details. He promised to sniff around. By the time I hung up, Wolfe was already rising. Not much, just shifting in his chair like an earthquake under the upholstery. That was his version of alarm bells. He muttered, almost to himself, "To accept custody of a sealed enigma at an appointed hour is to become an accomplice in another man's scheme. This, Archie, I do not relish." I nodded. "Yeah, but it beats explaining to Kramer's widow why we let him walk into a firing squad." The clock struck noon, and in the silence that followed, the envelope in the safe might as well have been ticking. The clock ticked on, and if you ask me, the office was getting smaller with every passing minute. Wolfe didn't move, but his bulk alone has a way of crowding a room when his mind's chewing over something. I wasn't chewing, just pacing, but I was hungry for action. Sitting on a powder keg until midnight wasn't my idea of a lively Saturday. The phone rang again at noon. I grabbed it, hoping it was Saul. It wasn't. This time it was Lon Cohen from the Gazette, his voice quick with the kind of excitement that means somebody's making headlines without permission. "Archie, tell your boss the commissioner's office is tighter than a drum. Something's brewing with Kramer, and the city desk thinks Wolfe's in the soup. What's cooking?" "Lon," I said, "if I told you Wolfe was running a cakewalk, you'd print that he's moonlighting at the bakery. Keep your ears open. If Kramer shows up on your crime blotter, let me know." I hung up and found Wolfe's eyes on me. He hadn't missed a word. "The noose draws tighter," he murmured. "And still the players do not reveal themselves." "They're revealing something," I said. "A photograph. A mystery woman, and now Lon chirping like a canary. Looks like Kramer's been dealing with more than parking tickets. Phooey. Obvious. It is the identities of his companions that matter." Wolfe shifted a little deeper into the chair. "Archie, assemble the list." That was code for, "We're moving into suspect's territory." I pulled out my notebook and waited. Wolfe closed his eyes, lips moving just slightly as though cataloging pieces in his head. First, the unknown man in the photograph. Gaunt, sharp-featured, dangerous. Second, the woman who telephoned. Her voice betrayed agitation. Third, Inspector Cramer himself, who is not exempt, for he alone placed the envelope here. Fourth, whoever left the card and the package at our door. The handwriting suggests one author. "Great," I said. "We're up to 4 and I haven't even had lunch." "You may also add the commissioner's office," Wolfe continued, "which, if Mr. Cohen is correct, is roiled by secrets. Political motive is never absent." That gave me 5. A nice, healthy circle of suspects. Trouble was, they weren't so much a circle as a fog. Wolfe hates fog unless it's condensed in a beer glass. I was still considering how to get my arms around that when the bell rang again. If this kept up, I'd installed turnstiles. At the door stood Stebbins, his bulldog mug tight as a knot. "Archie, I need to see Wolfe." "Now." I led him in, and he planted himself in front of Wolfe's desk like a cop in church, stiff but uncomfortable. "Wolfe, something's wrong. Kramer's missing. His car's in the lot at the precinct, but nobody's seen him since early morning." Wolfe tilted his head. "Missing, you say? That is a word police are usually loath to employ." "Well, hell, he's gone. And I got word there's chatter about a meeting he had with some guy last night. No names, but there's heat." I shot Wolfe a look, but his eyelids lowered like shutters. "Mr. Stebbins," he said evenly, "I cannot aid you without details." Stebbins cursed under his breath and shoved a crumpled slip of paper across the desk. "That's all I've got. Guy's name came up once. Miles Coric, ex-council aide, thrown out 2 years ago for graft. Mean reputation." That rang a bell. It had to be the sharp-nosed gent from the photograph. Wolfe gave the faintest nod. "Thank you, Mr. Stebbins. Archie will see you out." Stebbins looked like he wanted to argue, but Wolfe had already shut his eyes again, which was the equivalent of lowering a curtain. I hustled Stebbins out before he started barking. Back in the office, I slapped the name down in my notebook. "So our gaunt friend is Miles Coric, blacklisted, crooked, and chewing breakfast with Kramer. That's one suspect with a pedigree." Wolfe grunted. "Indeed, and you will find him." I groaned. "Figures. Where do I start?" "Begin with the directory. He will not be far from mischief." So I made a few calls, greased a few informants, and by 3 o'clock had an address for Coric in a shabby West Side block where landlords went to die. I grabbed my hat and checked my gun. Not that I planned to use it, but I like having company in bad neighborhoods. Coric's place was on the 2nd floor, peeling paint, cracked steps. I knocked, waited, then let myself in with the universal key, my shoulder. Inside smelled of old cigars and desperation. The walls were lined with yellowing clippings, all about city contracts and council scandals. And right on the table sat another brown envelope, this one ripped open, contents gone. The sound of a floorboard creaking behind me spun me around. A woman stood there, tall, dark coat, wide-brim hat shading her face. Her hand gripped a purse like it was hiding something sharper. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I get that a lot," I told her. "You phoned Wolfe, didn't you?" Her eyes flickered, which was all the confirmation I needed. "If you have that envelope, you don't understand what it means. Try me." She shook her head and her voice dropped. "It's death, for him, for Kramer, maybe for you." That was when she bolted, slipping past me with surprising speed. By the time I hit the hallway, she was gone, footsteps vanishing down the stairs. I didn't chase her. Call me cautious, or just smart about not running blind in strange territory. Instead, I searched the place. The only clue worth pocketing was a torn photograph on the floor. Half a picture showing Kramer again, this time shaking hands with a second man whose face was sliced away. Whoever had ripped it wanted that other half invisible. I headed back to the brownstone with the torn photo in my pocket and a brain buzzing like neon. Wolfe listened without moving a muscle as I reported. When I laid the half photo on his desk, he picked it up delicately. "A puzzle piece," he murmured. "And the woman, clearly an accomplice, or perhaps more." "Yeah. She called, she showed, she ran. Not exactly Miss Subtlety." Wolfe tapped the photo. "But significant. Kramer shaking hands. Coric nearby. Someone missing." He looked at me, his eyes sharp for the first time all day. "Archie, the circle narrows. Tonight, at midnight, this picture will complete itself." The room felt tighter again, the safe heavier, and the clock louder. Midnight was only 9 hours away, and the brownstone was starting to feel like a trap waiting to be sprung. Wolfe didn't order beer this time. That told me he wasn't just annoyed. He was working. He sat there with the half photo between his fingers as though sheer stubbornness would coax the missing half back into existence. I'd seen him do it before. Pin down a clue with his eyes until the rest of the picture started walking in by itself. But he didn't need to say a word. I already knew what was coming. "Archie," he said finally, "go find the other half." I nodded. "Sure. While I'm at it, I'll fetch the Hope Diamond and tomorrow's racing results." He ignored me. "This matter is like a chessboard in which the queen is absent. We must discover who occupies that space. And you," he gave me a glare as heavy as a subpoena, "will search." So I went. First stop was Saul Panzer, because if anyone had eyes sharp enough to trace a missing face, it was Saul. He'd been shadowing Kramer since morning, and I found him parked across from the precinct in his jalopy that always looked like it was one turn from retirement. "Report," I said, sliding into the passenger seat. "Kramer left early," Saul told me. "Around 7, maybe earlier. He didn't come back. No one's seen him since. A guy, matching Coric's description, tailed him last night, but I lost him around 110th. That tightened the noose another notch. And since then, ghost. Either he's in hiding or somebody's keeping him there." Saul adjusted his hat brim. "What's Wolfe want?" "The missing half of a photograph. Kramer shaking hands with somebody, face cut out." Saul gave a low whistle. "That smells political. Wolfe hates politics." "Yeah," I said, "but politics loves him anyway. Keep on Kramer if you can. If he surfaces, I want to know before his barber does." I left Saul and pointed myself toward Coric's known haunts. A guy like him leaves ripples. Old colleagues, taverns, shadows in alleys. I started with a bar off 9th Avenue where washed-up operators nursed both grudges and whiskey. Inside it was dim, with a jukebox muttering to itself in the corner and 2 men snoring over their drinks. Behind the bar stood a woman with tired eyes and a memory for faces. "Looking for Coric," I said. She gave me a glance sharp enough to cut glass. "He doesn't drink here anymore." "Doesn't or can't?" "Let's just say he owes more than tabs. Last time he showed, he was jawing with a councilman who didn't want his picture taken." That set bells ringing. "Councilman who?" She shook her head. "My ears ain't for hire." I slipped a bill across the bar. "Call it hazard pay." She sighed. "Brigham. Councilman Alton Brigham. He and Coric were thick once before the city tossed Coric. But if you tell anyone I said that, I'll deny it till Judgment Day." I pocketed the name and left before she got ideas about charging me rent for air. Brigham was still in office, a smooth operator with enough enemies to fill Yankee Stadium. If he was the one shaking Kramer's hand in that photo, the storm we were sitting under had just grown teeth. I phoned Wolfe from a pay booth. "Got a name. Brigham. Could be our missing half." His grunt was audible even through static. "Predictable. Bring him in." "Sure. I'll just flash a smile and drag a councilman across town. That'll be easy." "Archie, do not dally." That was Wolfe's way of saying, "I don't care how you do it, but if you come back empty-handed, find another address to sleep at." I headed uptown. Brigham's office was on the 3rd floor of a municipal building stuffed with the kind of secretaries who could detect a reporter at 50 paces. I introduced myself as a freelance stringer sniffing a rumor. They sniffed me right back, but I caught Brigham himself slipping out for lunch. I fell in step with him on the sidewalk. He was tall, balding, and carried himself like a man who believed sidewalks were paved for his convenience. "Councilman Brigham," I said. "Archie Goodwin, Nero Wolfe's office. You've been keeping interesting company lately." He stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do. A gaunt gent named Coric, and a picture that makes you look cozy with Inspector Kramer." His face drained just enough to confirm I was right. "That's absurd. I won't discuss..." I slipped the torn half photo from my pocket and held it just long enough for him to see Kramer's half. We've got this much. Wonder who was on the other side. Brigham's jaw worked. He glanced around like he expected every lamppost to sprout ears. You don't know what you're playing with, Goodwin. That photograph could ruin men. That's the idea, I said. Now you come in with me, or do I need to call a cab? He hesitated, then muttered, Fine, but I'll speak only to Wolfe. By the time I herded him into the brownstone office, Wolfe had positioned himself with a glass of beer and an expression that could have soured cream. Brigham sat stiff as a poker, eyes darting to the safe as if he could smell the envelope inside. You consort with Miles Coric, Wolfe said without preamble. Brigham bristled. I was approached, that's all. He wanted assurances. Regarding what? Wolfe's voice was silk over steel. Brigham's lips thinned. A file. Documents that never should have seen daylight. He claimed Kramer had them. I told him if that were true, the commissioner's office would bury it fast. And yet, Wolfe said, an envelope arrived here. From Inspector Kramer. Brigham paled. Then it's true. He has it. I leaned forward. What's in the file? Brigham swallowed. Contracts, payoffs. Enough to topple half the council. Coric kept copies before he was ousted. He thinks Kramer is his leverage. But if that envelope is what I think it is... He broke off, realizing he'd said too much. Wolfe set down his glass. If indeed the envelope contains such records, it explains why Kramer is hunted. But it does not explain why he entrusted it to me. Brigham stood abruptly. I won't be part of this. If you're wise, Wolfe, you'll destroy it. He stormed out before I could stop him. I turned to Wolfe. Well, that's one suspect who runs faster than the woman. What now? Wolfe's gaze returned to the safe. Now, Archie, we have our circle. Kramer, Coric, the woman, Brigham, all tethered to that envelope. Midnight will tell us which rope breaks. I don't know if it was the look in his eyes or the weight of the safe in the corner, but the whole office felt like a loaded gun waiting for a trigger. Midnight was getting closer, and the brownstone was no longer a sanctuary. It was the center of a storm. The office had gone quiet after Brigham's hasty exit, the kind of quiet that wasn't peace so much as the pause before a storm. Wolfe hadn't shifted an inch. His gaze was pinned to the safe as if he could already hear the envelope breathing inside. I'd been with him long enough to know he was balancing three things at once. Kramer's disappearance, Brigham's panic, and the fact that someone was bold enough to turn our brownstone into a dead drop. I didn't get a chance to comment because the silence cracked with the sound of the front door clicking open. Not the bell, not Fritz's tread, but the unmistakable creak of brass hinges, soft as a thief. My gun was out before I'd crossed the rug. Wolfe's eyes opened, dark and cold. I moved fast through the hall. The door was ajar by inches. Whoever it was had left in a hurry, or wanted us to think they had. I yanked it wide, checked the stoop, and caught the faint scuff of shoes retreating toward the corner. By the time I hit the sidewalk, the street was empty except for a milk truck and a dog walker. Whoever had come nosing around didn't plan to stick for coffee. When I returned, Wolfe's jaw was set like stone. Archie, take inventory. I didn't need him to explain. I went straight to the office drawers, the files, the phone table. At first glance, nothing was touched until I saw the safe dial gleaming faintly, as if someone's hand had brushed it. Fritz swore he hadn't come near it, and Wolfe, sure as sunrise, wouldn't break his own rules. Which left one answer. Somebody came in here with sticky fingers and ideas about the safe, I said. Lucky for us, they don't know the combination. Wolfe exhaled heavily, a sound closer to a growl. Audacious. To enter my house unbidden, to touch my safe. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were harder. We are no longer wardens of a secret. We are quarry. That wasn't music to my ears. The brownstone's always been a fortress, Wolfe its immovable king. The idea that strangers could come waltzing in and test the locks left me cold. I checked with Fritz again, and he admitted sheepishly that he'd been in the kitchen with a delivery boy. Groceries. Nothing sinister. That window had been just enough for our guest to slip in. Subtle trespass, Wolfe would call it. To me, it was a warning. If they could walk in once, they could try again. Wolfe gestured at the torn photograph still on his desk. Archie, your legwork has narrowed the circle. Now we know our intruder is desperate, emboldened, and familiar with intrusion. I suspect Miles Coric, but the woman too is not exempt. Nor Brigham, who trembles at the prospect of exposure. Take your pick, I said. Plenty of shaky hands going around. The phone rang, shrill and sudden. I grabbed it. Saul's voice was clipped. Archie, you'd better tell Wolfe. Kramer's car was found abandoned near Riverside. Driver's seat still warm. He's gone. Gone how? Gone. Either grabbed or hiding so deep he doesn't want daylight. Saul paused. And Archie, somebody was tailing me too. Lost him, but I didn't like the look. I thanked him and relayed the news. Wolfe listened, fingers drumming the arm of his chair. So, they escalate. They seek Kramer as urgently as they seek what he entrusted. The net tightens. I muttered something unprintable and sat down. If they're bold enough to walk in here, maybe we should call Kramer's office, get uniforms on the stoop. No, Wolfe said at once. The police, once admitted, will make demands. They will not honor midnight. You sure about that? Because I'd like to make it to midnight in one piece. He didn't answer, which was his way of saying my preference was noted and disregarded. Instead, he reached for the bell pull. Fritz, brandy. That was Wolfe's version of high alert. The afternoon dragged like a long fuse. Every knock on the door set my nerves twitching. Twice, delivery boys came with perfectly innocent packages. Once, a neighbor stopped by with a letter misdelivered. Each time I checked the locks, the windows, the stoop. The brownstone wasn't a home anymore. It was a stage set, and I couldn't tell whether we were actors or props. At dusk, I made a run to Coric's building, half hoping I'd catch him or the mystery woman nosing around. The place was dark, but the door had fresh scratches near the lock. Someone had broken in after me. Inside, the apartment looked like it had been searched by a cyclone. Drawers dumped, cushions gutted, files scattered. Whoever it was hadn't found what they wanted, or they wouldn't have left such a mess. I picked through the wreckage and found one thing worth keeping, a scrap of stationery with Brigham's name scribbled beside a figure. 50,000. Whether it was a bribe, a debt, or a ransom, I couldn't tell. But it smelled like leverage. By the time I made it back, Wolfe had settled into a grim fortress of stillness. I handed him the scrap. He read it once, placed it beside the photograph, and said, "So, the circle closes tighter. Kramer in peril, Coric ruthless, Brigham compromised, the woman desperate. All circling midnight. And us in the middle," I added. Wolfe didn't argue. He only glanced at the safe. Then, very quietly, he said, "Archie, tonight we will not merely receive revelation, we will invite it." I frowned. I mean we will not wait passively. Arrange for them to come. Brigham, Coric, the woman. Even Kramer, if he can be found. Midnight will be their hour, and mine. It was the way he said it that stuck with me. Cold, final, like he was already weighing their fates. I knew then that the trespass hadn't just unsettled him, it had resolved him. Wolfe wasn't going to sit idle while strangers poured at his fortress. Midnight wasn't just when the envelope opened. It was when Wolfe would open the trap. And somewhere in the city, Inspector Kramer, alive or dead, was the hinge on which it all swung. Wolfe's order to arrange for them to come meant my evening was going to be busier than a switchboard during a blackout. I started with Brigham, who picked up after 3 rings, his voice clipped and wary. When I told him Wolfe, required his presence at midnight. He spluttered something about council meetings and schedules until I mentioned the envelope and the fact that Wolfe would be opening it, whether Brigham was in the room or not. That did the trick. He agreed to come, though his tone suggested he'd rather chew nails. Next was Coric. Finding him wasn't easy. Rats don't usually keep their phones listed. But he had acquaintances who owed me favors. By 8 o'clock I had a message relayed to him. Show up at Wolfe's or risk his name being delivered to the police on a silver platter. I couldn't guarantee he'd take the bait, but the kind of man who rips apart his own apartment looking for leverage wasn't about to ignore an invitation like this. The woman was harder. All I had was her voice and the memory of her running faster than I liked. I worked the phones, called 2 operators who knew more about whispered calls than Ma Bell ever intended, and by sheer luck got a trace on her line from the afternoon. It led to a boarding house on East 39th. I swung by, rang the bell, and when she answered the door, her eyes widened like she'd been expecting wolves, not Wolfe's assistant. "You," she whispered. "Yeah, me. Wolfe wants you at his place tonight. Midnight. You show you might keep Kramer breathing. You don't, well." I let the silence fill in the rest. She didn't argue. She didn't promise either, but fear flickered across her face in a way that told me I'd see her again. By the time I got back, Wolfe had moved exactly 2 inches in his chair, but that was about 10 miles in Wolfe geography. He listened to my reports without interrupting, except for one eyebrow twitch when I mentioned the woman. When I finished, he poured himself another beer. "Good, they will come." "What about Kramer?" I asked. "If he's still missing by midnight." "He will come too," Wolfe said flatly. "One way or another, Archie. He is the fulcrum. Without him, the envelope is meaningless. The others will ensure he is brought." I didn't argue, but I wasn't so sure. If the opposition already had Kramer, midnight might be less of a meeting and more of a memorial. Still, Wolfe was locked in, and trying to nudge him off course would have been like trying to shove the Chrysler Building. Around 9, Saul phoned again. "Archie, listen, I picked up a trail on Kramer. Rumor only, but it's worth something. He was spotted at a warehouse down near the docks, Pier 17. 2 guys had him between them like bookends." That got my pulse up. "Dead or alive?" "Alive. He didn't look happy about it, but he was walking." I passed it on to Wolfe, and he gave me the order before I'd even finished. "Bring him." That meant another trip, this one to the waterfront where shadows multiply like rabbits. The warehouse was the kind of place you could lose a body without so much as a squeak. I moved slow, ears open, and sure enough heard voices through a cracked window. Inside, Kramer sat in a chair, hands tied, cigar nowhere in sight, scowling like a man who'd been forced onto the wrong side of a police lineup. Facing him were 2 muscle types, neither of whom looked capable of long division. I slipped inside, keeping to shadows, and caught the tail end of their conversation. "At midnight," one was saying. "That's when the boss said." The other nodded. "We deliver him. We're clear. Otherwise," he made a throat-slitting gesture. That was my cue. I stepped forward with my revolver steady and my voice louder than a parade. "Otherwise, you both get to find out what Sing Sing's cafeteria serves on Sundays." They froze, which was their first smart move of the night. 10 minutes later, I had Kramer untied, the 2 gorillas trussed up with their own rope, and we were heading for the car. "Goodwin," Kramer rasped as we drove. "If Wolfe doesn't open that damned envelope at midnight, You'll do nothing," I cut in. "You'll sit in his office, smoke a cigar, and let him orchestrate this circus. And if you're smart, you'll thank him after." By the time we pulled up at the brownstone, it was 10:15. Wolfe's face didn't change when he saw Kramer march in, but the faintest relaxation in his shoulders told me he'd gambled correctly. Fritz brought brandy for Kramer, and the inspector drank it like it was oxygen. The clock ticked louder as the hour crept closer. One by one they arrived, Brigham sweating under his polished exterior, the woman pale but resolute, and finally Coric, gaunt as ever, his eyes darting like a man searching for every exit in a burning building. Wolfe watched them settle, his expression unreadable, the safe looming in the corner like the elephant none of them wanted to name. "Gentlemen, madam," Wolfe began, "you are here because the skein of your entanglements has reached its inevitable knot. At midnight it will be cut. Until then, you will indulge me." No one spoke, not even Kramer, though his cigar glowed hot enough to set the drapes alight. I stood by the door, revolver in pocket, making sure no one got any ideas about leaving early. The air grew heavier with every tick. Outside, the city noise dimmed, as if even New York held its breath. Inside, Wolfe's gaze passed from Brigham to Coric to the woman, then to Kramer, like a general surveying troops before the final move. Midnight wasn't far now, and the brownstone no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a crucible, and Wolfe, steady as stone in his chair, was about to light the fire. The air in the office was packed so tight you could have bounced a nickel off it. Wolfe let it sit that way, his silence more commanding than any gavel. Midnight was still a ways off, but he had the room under his thumb already. Brigham shifted in his chair like he was trying to hide from his own conscience. Coric's eyes darted, calculating angles. The woman sat stiff, her knuckles pale against her purse. And Kramer, well, he glowered and smoked, which was as much composure as you could expect from him with half the council breathing down his neck through strangers. "Archie," Wolfe said, not raising his voice. "The envelope." I went to the safe, spun the dial, and brought it out. Just holding it felt like I'd lifted a live grenade. I placed it on Wolfe's desk with a little more care than I usually reserve for envelopes. His eyes didn't leave it, but he made no move to open it yet. Instead, he let the weight of it sit like a verdict waiting to be read. "Each of you knows," he said slowly, "why you are here. Some of you think you know more than the others. You are wrong." Coric sneered. "Big words. That paper belongs to me." Wolfe's brow arched. "Incorrect. It belongs to Inspector Kramer, who entrusted it to me, and it belongs in truth to the law. You, Mr. Coric, forfeited any claim the moment you sought to profit from its contents." Brigham leaned forward, sweat glistening on his temple. "If it's what I think it is, Wolfe, you're playing with fire. Those contracts, those names." "Indeed," Wolfe cut him off. "Names of councilmen who lined your pockets, perhaps? Figures that match the 50,000 scrawled in your associate's den? You fear ruin. Your fear is justified." Brigham went pale, but he held his ground. The woman's voice broke in, softer but sharper. "You don't understand. If those papers come out, it won't just ruin reputations. It will kill him." She jerked her chin toward Kramer. "They'll bury him for letting it reach this far." Kramer's cigar froze halfway to his lips. "Lady, I don't need you to tell me what my risks are. I did what I had to do. Better Wolfe hold it than watch it vanish into Coric's pockets or Brigham's desk drawer." Wolfe inclined his head slightly, like a king permitting a knight to speak. "Precisely. And now, all of you, be silent." The command landed. He sat straighter, fingertips pressed together, his bulk suddenly not lazy but immense, a mountain ready to move. "Archie," he said, read aloud the card that was delivered this morning. I pulled it from the pile, the block letters still bold as threat. "Keep Kramer's trust. Midnight decides." Wolfe let it hang there a moment, then said, "The handwriting matches the note on the photograph. Singular author. And that author sought to terrify Inspector Kramer, to terrify all of you into silence. They failed." Coric smirked. "So you'll open it? Then what? Hand it to the commissioner and watch a dozen men walk? No. Wolfe said, and his voice carried enough weight to snap the smirk off. At midnight, I will open it in this room, in front of all of you. But you should know, its contents are secondary. The envelope itself, its delivery, its timing, are the true stratagem. Someone needed to ensure that none of you could destroy it unseen. Therefore they forced my hand. Kramer growled. You saying I've been played? Wolfe's eyes flickered. Yes, and so have we all. The question is, by whom? That landed like a hammer. The woman swallowed. Brigham wiped his brow. Coric clenched his jaw. Wolfe let them stew while the clock ticked on, louder than it had any right to. Archie, Wolfe said again, place the photograph here. I set the torn half down. He turned it so it faced the suspects. Inspector Kramer, shaking hands with another man. This image was mutilated to remove the second figure. Why? Not to hide Kramer. He is public, exposed. It was to conceal the identity of the one he clasped. Mr. Brigham, I posit that was you. Brigham's lips trembled. I can't confirm that. You needn't, Wolfe said. The very fact you blanch is confirmation. You met with Kramer last night. Why? I didn't, Brigham snapped, but his eyes betrayed him. Coric's grin spread like oil. See? He's guilty as sin. All of it on him. Pfui. Wolfe's dismissal cracked the air. Your glee condemns you, Mr. Coric. You engineered this tangle, hoping to pit Brigham's fear against Kramer's duty. You expected the envelope to vanish in confusion, leaving you sole custodian of its duplicates, but you miscalculated. You failed to anticipate Kramer's stubborn honesty or his decision to entrust me. The woman's breath caught. Then it was you, she whispered at Coric. You dragged me into this with promises of protection. Shut up, Coric snarled, but Wolfe raised a hand. No, she will speak. She is not innocent, but she is desperate. She sought to warn us because she realized too late she was being used. Tell us, madam, who told you to call this house? To demand we burn the envelope. Her lips trembled, but she forced it out. Coric, he said if it disappeared, everyone would be safe. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes as though the pieces had finally aligned. When he opened them again, the mountain had spoken. Archie, he said softly, secure Mr. Coric. Midnight approaches, and we must prepare the stage for revelation. I drew my revolver. Coric's grin faltered. He looked from me to Wolfe, to the safe, then back to me. His eyes darted toward the door, but I shook my head. Don't bother. You're staying for the show. The clock ticked on, every second a drumbeat toward midnight, every breath heavier than the last. Wolfe had positioned his pieces, and now the board was his alone. Coric's laugh died quick when I kept the revolver steady on him. Wolfe hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved an inch, but somehow the whole room tilted his way. Midnight wasn't just closing in, it was already breathing down our necks. You've maneuvered, Mr. Coric, Wolfe said, his voice thick with disdain. But your clumsiness betrayed you. The trespass in this house, the attempt to coerce my assistant, the mutilation of the photograph. Your fingerprints are everywhere, though perhaps not literal ones. You hoped to pit fear against honor, to make Inspector Kramer appear compromised and Mr. Brigham ruined. And you, he shifted his gaze toward the woman. You were to be the chorus of alarm, to increase pressure, to force the envelope's destruction. A crude plan. The woman's eyes flashed. He said it was the only way. Of course he did, Wolfe replied almost lazily. For him, destruction of evidence was survival. But you, madam, you acted with divided conscience. Hence your warning call to me. That saved you from my complete contempt. Kramer barked around his cigar. Enough philosophy. Open the damned thing. Let's see what I've risked my neck for. Wolfe's gaze shifted to him, cool as glass. At midnight, Inspector. Not before. Until then, you will endure. The clock's hands crawled toward the hour. Fritz entered silently with coffee for me, brandy for Kramer, and nothing for Wolfe but another bottle of beer, which he sipped without looking away from his suspects. I stayed at my post with the gun, though truth be told, it wasn't the weapon keeping them pinned, it was Wolfe, who made the air so heavy that no one dared stir. At 5 minutes to 12, Wolfe leaned forward. "Mr. Brigham," the councilman jerked upright, "you will answer a question directly. Did you, in concert with Miles Coric, profit from city contracts that were illicit?" Brigham's lips trembled. Yes, Wolfe cut in before the denial could stumble out. "Your face betrays you, but I already knew. Your problem is not the crime itself, but the exposure. Exposure you fear because you think the papers in this envelope name you explicitly." "They do," Coric burst out. "I saw the copies myself." "Pfui," Wolfe snapped. "You saw what you wanted to see. The real danger is not the contracts, it is the narrative you seek to control. Mr. Brigham fears disgrace. You, Coric, crave leverage. The woman fears for Inspector Kramer's life. Each of you sees in this envelope only the shadow of your own guilt and desire. That is why you are here." The last words fell into silence that was broken only by the deep bong of the hall clock striking midnight. Wolfe didn't move immediately, letting the echoes settle like dust. Then, with a deliberate slowness that stretched every nerve in the room, he broke the seal and withdrew the papers. I leaned in, trying not to show it, but my stomach felt like it had been wound into a knot. Pages rustled in Wolfe's hands. His lips moved as his eyes devoured the lines. At last, he looked up, and the faintest smile curved his mouth. "Remarkable," he said softly. Kramer growled. "Out with it, Wolfe. What's in there? Not contracts, not names, not even money." Wolfe held up the sheets. "This is a confession, written, signed, and witnessed. A man high in office admitted to orchestrating the graft, to directing funds through shell companies, to purchasing votes. He named subordinates, but not Brigham, not Coric, not even you, Inspector. In short, the document incriminates one man, and he is already dead." The words hit like a hammer. Brigham sagged in relief. The woman blinked in disbelief. Coric, though, lurched forward. "You're lying. You're bluffing." "No," Wolfe said, serene now. "I rarely bluff. The confession belonged to your former patron, Miles Coric. He wrote it 2 years ago to shield himself if exposed. But he died in disgrace, and the confession was sealed away, until some fool decided to make use of it as a phantom." Kramer stared, smoke curling from his cigar. "Then why give it to you?" "Because," Wolfe replied, Kramer understood that the document was less important than the war it represented. Someone sought to resurrect a ghost and hang it on the living. He needed a neutral custodian. That is why he chose me. I am as neutral as stone. Coric's face twisted. "You think you've beaten me? That confession proves nothing. Dead men can't testify." "Exactly," Wolfe said, his tone final as a verdict, "which is why you sought to destroy it. Without it, you could spread whispers, plant photographs, blackmail the vulnerable. With it, your scheme collapses. You overplayed, Mr. Coric, and now, Inspector Kramer, arrest him." For once, Kramer didn't argue. He rose, shoulders squared, and nodded to me. Together we closed in. Coric tried to bolt, but my revolver convinced him otherwise. Kramer snapped the cuffs on with grim satisfaction. The woman started to speak, but Wolfe lifted a finger. "You are guilty of poor judgment and cowardice, madam, but not of crime. Go. Leave this house, and do not return." She hesitated, then fled, coat swirling. Brigham stayed frozen in his chair until Wolfe dismissed him with a withering glance. He scurried out like a rat freed from a trap. The room emptied, leaving only Wolfe, Kramer, and me. Wolfe stacked the confession neatly, sealed it in a new envelope, and handed it to Kramer. "This, Inspector, is for your commissioner." Let him decide whether to bury a dead man's sins or parade them. It matters little. The true crime tonight was the manipulation, and that is ended. Kramer pocketed it, his scowl softer now, almost grateful. Damn you, Wolfe, you saved my hide. Pfui, Wolfe muttered, already reaching for the beer Fritz brought in on cue. I preserved order, that is all. Kramer left, dragging Coric with him. The door closed, and the brownstone was ours again. Wolfe settled back, eyes half shut, his bulk sagging into the chair as though the storm had passed. I holstered my revolver and let out a long breath. Well, that was a lively midnight. Any chance tomorrow's quieter? Wolfe closed his eyes and murmured, "Only if you refrain from answering the door." I grinned, poured myself a drink, and thought about how long it would take before the next knock rattled the fortress. When the last echo of the door latch faded, Wolfe didn't move right away. He let the silence linger like cigar smoke hanging in the rafters, heavy and deliberate. I'd seen it before. He was sealing the case in his mind, putting each piece in its neat drawer. Only when Fritz reappeared with a fresh bottle and set it beside him did Wolfe stir, reaching for it with the kind of languid finality that told me the storm had broken, at least in his head. "You know," I said, leaning against the desk, "I've seen parades less crowded than this office tonight. And still, you sit there like a traffic light, blinking red while everyone else scrambles." His lips twitched, though whether from amusement or indigestion, I'll never know. "Archie, humanity is tiresome. But the patterns, those at least are tolerable." I shook my head. Patterns? We just dodged blackmail, political ruin, and a probable homicide, and you call it tolerable. Because it is resolved. He gestured lazily at the safe, now empty of its burden. The envelope was never the fulcrum. It was the illusion of power, the bait dangled before men consumed by fear and ambition. Their reactions revealed more than any document. He wasn't wrong. Brigham's sweating panic, the woman's wavering conscience, Coric's oily scheming, all of it had played out under Wolfe's gaze like actors hitting their cues. Still, there was one thing that didn't sit right. So Kramer gambled, dropping it in your lap, hoping you'd turn the trick. He ever tell you why he didn't just sit on it himself? Wolfe closed his eyes. Because he is not me. He knows his own temper. He would have brandished it too soon, and the vultures would have torn it apart. He sought a mind immovable by threat. He chose correctly. I couldn't argue with that, though I doubted Kramer would ever admit aloud that he trusted Wolfe more than his own badge. The doorbell rang again. I groaned. If that's another councilman, I'm moving out. But it wasn't. Saul Panzer stepped in, quiet as always, hat in hand. He glanced at me, then at Wolfe. "It's done. Coric's booked. Stebbins says Brigham's already on the phone trying to untangle himself, and the woman's disappeared. Thought you'd want the update." Wolfe nodded once. "Thank you, Saul. Your efficiency is appreciated." Saul tipped his hat and left, as noiseless as he'd entered. The brownstone was finally empty again, the fortress reclaimed. I poured myself a drink, leaned back, and studied Wolfe. He looked comfortable now, restored to his natural element, a man who had turned chaos into order without ever leaving his chair. "So what happens to Kramer?" asked. "He will deliver the confession to his commissioner," Wolfe said. "They will decide whether to trumpet it or bury it. Likely the latter. A dead man cannot defend himself, and the city prefers its ghosts quiet. Inspector Kramer will retain his post, his honor, and his cigar." "Neat and tidy," I sipped. "And Brigham?" Wolfe grimaced. "Brigham will survive. Such men always do. He will trim his sails, feign contrition, and wait for the next tide. But he will not forget tonight. Fear is a stubborn tutor." That left the woman. And her? A casualty of conscience. She will fade into obscurity, which is mercy. I set down my glass. "And Coric?" Wolfe's eyes opened, sharp as knives. Coric sought to manipulate not only Kramer, but me. That cannot be forgiven. He will find prison walls less yielding than I. I couldn't help grinning. I'll be sure to send him a fruit basket. For a while, we sat in the quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock and Wolfe's slow, steady breathing. It felt like the house itself was unwinding, muscles unclenching after too long coiled tight. Finally, I said, "You know, if you'd opened that envelope at 10 instead of midnight, we could have been in bed by now." His eyes flickered toward me, and I swear I caught the faintest glint of humor. Midnight, Archie, was the appointed hour. The drama required its stage. Drama, huh? Remind me to buy tickets next time, so at least I get a seat that isn't armed. Wolfe harumphed, reached for the final sip of his beer, and let the silence take over again. The case of the letter Kramer hid at midnight was closed, filed away in Wolfe's mind like all the others, heavy, final, and bound tight. And me? I just made a note to double-lock the door in the morning. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that even in Wolfe's fortress, there's always another knock waiting. The brandy glass sat empty on Wolfe's desk, and Kramer's smoke still lingered like an uninvited guest, even though the inspector himself had already stormed off with Coric in tow. Wolfe had withdrawn into his shell again, half-closed eyes and lips pressed so tight you'd think he was conserving words for the next decade. The only sign that he wasn't asleep was the occasional twitch of a finger against the armrest, like a conductor keeping silent time after the orchestra's done. I'd been through this routine enough to know better than to fill the silence with chatter. Instead, I stretched out on the couch, one leg over the arm, and watched Fritz collect the glasses with a disapproving cluck about ashes on his carpet. He never mentioned the fact that half the city council had just been put through Wolfe's ringer right under his nose. That wasn't Fritz's department. His concern was the drapes, the upholstery, and that the dining room stayed inviolate. Finally, Wolfe spoke. "Archie." "Still here," I said, as if he might have thought I'd slipped out for a soda. "You will prepare a memorandum for my files. The confession remains with the commissioner. Our record must contain the ancillary details, the trespass, the photograph, the woman's intrusion, Mr. Brigham's disgrace." I groaned. So much for sleeping in. "You know how long it'll take to type all that?" "As long as it takes," he murmured. "Accuracy is labor, but labor poorly done is worse than idleness." That was his way of saying I'd better not take liberties with the facts, even if my typewriter had to sweat ink. I made a mental note to add a few choice adjectives under my breath while pounding the keys. The quiet returned, and I thought we'd wrap the night until the phone rang. I picked it up, already braced for trouble. It was Stebbins, sounding like someone had spiked his coffee with vinegar. "Goodwin, tell Wolfe thanks, if he can hear me through that wall of his. Coric's not talking, but we've got enough from the evidence you passed to tie him up for years. Brigham's gone to ground, but the commissioner says to keep it quiet for now. No headlines, not yet." I relayed the gist to Wolfe, who responded with a kind of grunt that meant he'd expected exactly that. "Of course," he said. "The city prefers its scandals embalmed before burial." That was all Stebbins got out of him, but I added, "Send flowers, Stebbins. Wolfe thrives on gratitude." He hung up before I could hear the growl on the other end. The night wore on. The brownstone creaked back into its old rhythms, Fritz preparing for tomorrow's menu, Wolfe retreating into his chair with the orchids on his mind instead of councilman. I should have been relieved, but something kept nagging at me. I shifted in my seat until Wolfe cracked an eye. "What is it now?" he asked. "Maybe nothing," I said. But Coric wasn't the only one who wanted that envelope gone. Brigham will crawl out from under his rock again, and the woman, she's still out there. What if they circle back? "Let them," Wolfe said simply. "They will find nothing here. The envelope has fulfilled its purpose. The actors have been unmasked. Their return would only confirm their folly." "That's comforting," I said dryly. "We'll just put up a sign. No more midnight visits. Management closed for the season. His lips curved slightly, which for Wolfe was the equivalent of a belly laugh. Archie, you complain, yet you relish the engagement. Admit it. I shrugged. I relish the part where we don't end up shot at. You are alive, he said, closing his eyes again. And so am I. That is sufficient. The next morning came grey and damp, New York sulking under a drizzle. Kramer dropped by, unannounced, looking like he'd been through a cement mixer. He didn't sit. He just stood in front of Wolfe's desk, scowling as usual. It's handled, he said. The commissioners decided the confession stays sealed. The city doesn't need ghosts clawing out of graves. Wolfe inclined his head, neither approving nor dissenting. Pragmatic. Kramer hesitated, then muttered, "You've got my thanks, Wolfe. Don't make me repeat it." He jabbed his cigar in my direction. "And Goodwin, keep your wisecracks out of the papers." "Who, me?" I asked, all innocence. He grunted and left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the orchids upstairs. Wolfe sighed as if the noise alone were sacrilege. "Archie, lock the door." I did, wondering if he meant against Kramer, Brigham, or the world in general. Probably all three. By evening, the house was back in order. Fritz served squab with more ceremony than a state dinner. Wolfe ate in silence, and I managed to sneak in a slice of Fritz's apple tart before Wolfe reminded me that the memorandum still wasn't typed. The case of the letter Kramer hid at midnight had folded back into the brownstone's walls, filed away like every other storm we'd weathered, leaving behind only ashtrays full of cigars and Wolfe's quiet satisfaction. And as I sat at my typewriter, keys clacking, I thought about how close the city had come to watching its pillars crumble over a dead man's confession. Wolfe had wrestled the truth into its corner without leaving his chair. Me, I'd just carried the weight of the legwork and the risk. That's the partnership. When I finally finished the memorandum and looked up, Wolfe was asleep in his chair, the orchids waiting upstairs for him tomorrow. I shook my head, turned off the light, and thought. Midnight had passed, the letter had spoken, and the brownstone was still standing, which, for us, counted as a happy ending. The brownstone always breathes different the day after a storm. Fritz hums in the kitchen, the orchids get their private audience upstairs, and Wolfe settles into his chair with the kind of gravity that makes you forget he ever lifted the lid on a powder keg. But storms don't leave without a trace, and by mid-morning the phone was already proving it. Lon Cohen called first, his voice buzzing like a wire about to snap. "Archie, the city desk's screaming for blood. There's talk Brigham's on the ropes, whispers about missing contracts, and a rumor that Wolfe's sitting on the lid. Give me a bone." I told him the only bone he'd get was the one in Fritz's soup, and hung up before he could start singing in italics. Then came Stebbins, growling that the commissioner was ready to sit on Brigham if he twitched wrong, but wanted Wolfe to keep his distance. By the time Saul checked in to report that Coric's arraignment was already scheduled, I figured half of Manhattan had its nose pressed to the glass of last night's show. Wolfe listened to my summaries without comment, which is Wolfe for "I'm filing it all where it belongs." When I finally sat down with coffee, he opened his eyes, just long enough to drop his verdict. "Archie, the residue of this matter will fester, but not fatally. We excised the malignancy. The body politic will resume its squalid rhythm." "Neat diagnosis, Doc," I said. "But what about Brigham? He's still in the chair, and if the contracts really do name him, then his fear will govern him better than prosecution," Wolfe said flatly. "His votes will be cautious, his voice quieter. That is punishment enough." It sounded like philosophy, but I knew Wolfe well enough to recognize contempt disguised as restraint. He didn't care about politics unless it sloshed into his beer, but he cared about balance, and for him, Brigham sweating through the rest of his term was balance. By afternoon, the drizzle had lifted, and with it came another visitor. This time there was no pounding, no intrusion, just a knock so timid Fritz nearly ignored it. When he ushered her in, the woman looked smaller, her hat pulled low, her purse clutched like a shield. "I came to thank you," she said softly, for not turning me over." Wolfe regarded her as if she were a bug pinned under glass. "You are of no further interest to me." Her eyes flickered. "But to others I may still be." I was about to usher her out when Wolfe lifted a finger. "You fear reprisal. From Mr. Brigham, perhaps? Or from Mr. Coric's associates?" She nodded once, barely. "Then you will go where your name is unknown," Wolfe said. "Leave the city. Your usefulness is exhausted. Remain, and you will be exploited until nothing is left." She drew in a shaky breath. "That's not advice. It's a sentence." "It is survival," Wolfe replied. "You may choose otherwise." "I do not care." She looked at me as if for a translation, but I only spread my hands. "You heard the man. He's not running a witness protection service." She left without another word. I closed the door behind her, thinking how many ghosts New York makes in a year, and how many keep walking around breathing. The rest of the day drifted quiet, but quiet in this house has its own weight. Wolfe returned to his orchids, Fritz to his pots, and me to the typewriter, pounding out the memorandum Wolfe demanded. Every sentence felt like I was pressing the keys into wet cement. The photograph, the trespass, the midnight gathering. When I finally yanked the last sheet free, my fingers were sore and Wolfe's orchids had been lectured into the next generation. Evening brought one more ripple. Kramer returned, not storming this time, not barking, but steady, the way a man walks when he's carrying more than he says. He stood in the office, his hat low, and for a second I thought he might actually thank Wolfe again. Instead he grunted, "The commissioners decided. The confession stays sealed. Official line is that Coric acted alone, Brigham was duped, and the rest never happened." Wolfe's mouth twitched. Predictable. The city prefers its sins buried with ceremony. Kramer shoved his hands in his pockets. "You know as well as I do, that paper could have blown this whole town open." "And achieved what?" Wolfe countered. "Ruin. Chaos, a reshuffling of scoundrels. Better to let a dead man's guilt remain his own. The living will manage their appetites." Kramer scowled, but he didn't argue. He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Wolfe. I sleep easier knowing you had it. Not me." That was about as close as Kramer ever came to an embrace. He left before either of us could ruin it. I looked at Wolfe. So that's it. The city breathes, the guilty squirm, and we file another memorandum. Case closed. He opened his eyes, heavy with finality. "No, Archie, not closed. Merely concluded. The city will go on as it always does. The lesson, however, is eternal. Power is not in the possession of evidence, but in the perception of it. Men ruined themselves not by what was written, but by what they feared might be." I let that hang in the air. Wolfe always liked his conclusions marinated in philosophy. Later, over dinner, Fritz served roast duck with a sauce that probably required 3 days, and a minor miracle. Wolfe ate with a kind of concentration he reserved for only 2 things: food and deduction. When the plates were cleared, he leaned back and gave the kind of sigh that meant he'd restored the balance of his universe. I raised my glass. "To midnight letters and the fools who think paper can save them." Wolfe harumphed, but there was the faintest glint in his eyes. And as the clock struck 10, I thought about how the city outside kept spinning in its crooked orbit, while inside the brownstone order had been restored. Not by the law, not by politics, but by Wolfe, immovable as always. The last echoes of Kramer's visit still clung to the air, smoke and all, but Wolfe was already back in his chair, eyes closed, hands resting like a judge whose verdict had been rendered. Midnight had passed, The envelope was gone, and yet the house carried the faint tension of a battlefield after the armies have marched off. I sat with a bourbon and wondered, as I sometimes do after Wolfe pulls the rug out from under a crowd, whether he'd actually planned every step or just made it look that way. Either answer was terrifying enough. The day passed with fewer interruptions than usual, as though the city itself had conspired to let Wolfe digest both dinner and deduction. But quiet never stays innocent here. By dusk, Lon Cohen was back on the line, desperate for copy. "Archie, give me something. The papers are full of Coric's mugshot, but everyone's whispering about Wolfe's midnight séance. Was it contracts? Blackmail? A council coup?" "Lon," I told him, "if you want fiction, call a novelist. Wolfe's not handing out headlines." I hung up before he could scream into the receiver. Wolfe, of course, hadn't moved a finger, but gave the faintest grunt of approval, which in his language meant I'd handled it correctly. After dinner, Fritz disappeared into the kitchen with his usual dignity, and the brownstone silence wrapped around us like heavy drapes. Wolfe gestured for me to sit, which was the sign he was ready to deliver the coda. "Archie," he said, his voice heavy but precise, "observe the lesson." I leaned back. Always do. The envelope was not dangerous in itself. It contained only words of a dead man. Yet men trembled, schemed, and trespassed because of what they imagined those words to mean. Fear, Archie, is a sharper blade than truth. It cuts deeper. He paused, letting the weight of it sit. I'd seen him end plenty of cases with a neat bow, but this was different. He wasn't just lecturing me. He was filing the case under some eternal law he kept inside his head. Kramer survived not by his badge, but by his stubborn honesty. Brigham remains, chastened because his fear will govern him more than prosecution ever could. The woman will vanish because her conscience betrayed her loyalty. And Coric. Wolfe's lips tightened. Coric destroyed himself, long before I moved a finger. He was undone by his own desperation. I swirled the bourbon in my glass. So in the end, nobody won. Not really. On the contrary, Wolfe replied, eyes opening just enough to pin me. Order won. Balance was restored. That is all that matters. He reached for the bell cord, and Fritz appeared with the final course. Cheese, of course, arranged with the kind of precision that would have pleased Wolfe, even if the city outside had crumbled to dust. As Wolfe savored it, I thought about how close the whole circus had come to blowing up in our laps. Midnight had been a blade edge, and Wolfe had walked it without breaking stride. Me, I'd just played the wire, while the tightrope walker kept his balance. That's the job. When the plates were cleared and the house had quieted for the night, Wolfe leaned back, eyes half closed, and delivered the final line. Archie, remember, truth is rarely the lever. Perception is. Men ruin themselves not by what is, but by what they believe may be. I finished my bourbon, stood and stretched. Fine, but next time, tell Kramer to hide his letters somewhere else. Midnight's bad for my digestion. Wolfe harumphed, reached for his beer, and closed his eyes again. And just like that, the case of the letter Kramer hid at midnight was over. Filed, sealed, and tucked away in Wolfe's vast mental cabinet, while I made a note to buy stronger locks for the front door. Because in this house, there's always another knock coming.